Well, for more on this, joining me live now from New York is Ben Norton, a journalist with Fair Media Watch. Ben, give us a bit of an idea on the latest of what's happening on the ground in Venezuela and what the reaction to this has been.
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, we need to recognize that what's really happening right now is a foreign-declared coup inside Venezuela. Instead of letting the Venezuelan people decide what they're going to do for themselves, the United States and its allies, including Canada, the Liberal government in Canada, the Donald Trump administration, and other regional powers in Latin America have essentially declared that they will no longer recognize the government of Venezuela and that the opposition is now the government. So really, this is going to further ignite the chaos and violence inside Venezuela, further destabilize the country, and actually, it's not going to in any way try to protect democracy. It's really just going to create more of the turmoil. And the opposition is, of course, exploiting this. And it's very dangerous and very troubling because instead of encouraging essentially a coup, the international community should be encouraging dialogue between the opposition and the government.
So, Ben, I guess that is one of the things. I mean, you have written that this is essentially creating a coup, but these people on the ground in Venezuela, they do have some very genuine concerns with what's happening in their country at the moment, and I guess they're probably feeling a little bit restricted as to what they can do to help this situation.
Absolutely. There are economic problems in Venezuela. There's no question. There's very, very bad inflation. Some goods are scarce. But there are also problems in many other parts of the region. So the violence and poverty, for instance, is much worse in Mexico, but no one is calling for foreign military intervention. No one is calling for recognizing the opposition to be the government in Mexico. Mexico just had a democratically elected leader. And similarly, in Venezuela, there was just a presidential election in May of 2018, but the opposition boycotted that election. And again, we see here that the reality is much more complex than the one-sided narrative that we hear of this brutal dictator crushing the peaceful opposition. Actually, it's much more complex. The opposition has repeatedly boycotted multiple elections and has said that actually it prefers a military coup. Members of the government, elected members of the National Assembly of the opposition, have repeatedly called for the military to rise up against Maduro and to overthrow the president. Can you imagine in Australia or in the United States if members of the parliament or the Congress here had risen up and called for the military to overthrow the president? I mean, the situation in Venezuela is much more complex, and we need to understand the historical context and not just these talking points that we hear that are not historically contextual.
Yeah, I guess that is one of the things. It is hard to fathom that sort of complexity in the country there. But, of course, where do we go from here? How does this get solved? And what do you think the likelihood of seeing any intervention by US military is?
Well, the possibility of U.S. military intervention is, in the words of the Trump administration, on the table. Trump administration officials said all options are on the table. And anyone in the international community should be very terrified because the possibility could literally be a civil war. We could see something like Syria happen inside Venezuela. And let's be clear, the opposition, there certainly have been peaceful protests against the economic chaos. There certainly has been. But at the same time, for years, there have been extremely violent protests. And this is not stressed enough. In June 2017, a police agent named Oscar Perez actually hijacked a helicopter and attacked the Supreme Court in Venezuela with grenades. And that's what led the president, Maduro, to call for the election of a constituent assembly. And the idea was to bring the opposition in and to have a new election and to create this body that could democratically represent the Venezuelan people. Well, the opposition responded by boycotting that election. And again, we see that they have actually preferred calls for military intervention, preferred calls for a coup. So the answer, what the international community needs to do is, again, call for no violence, stop the calls for military intervention, stop the calls for a coup, and call for peace talks to come together. As actually happened a few years ago, the Vatican sponsored peace talks between the opposition and Maduro, and the opposition walked away from those peace talks. So, again, we need to have a more complex understanding. There certainly are very legitimate grievances, but the opposition actually has a fair amount of blood on its hands and has carried out violence. And until both sides can meet, and until specifically the opposition can stop resorting to violence and calls for military intervention, there won't be peace and there won't be a political settlement inside Venezuela.
All right, Ben, well, thank you very much for your time and also your insight this afternoon. Certainly a very volatile situation at the moment in Venezuela. Coming up after the break, Bob Catter slammed by